So, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And it just are going to promote your book quite a bit and are on book tours and things like that.
Yeah.
And so maybe tell us what prompted you to write the book. And there's quite a bit of an inflation about AI books around. So where do you see your book fits into the world, and what's the idea behind your book?
I'd be happy to do that, Stefan. First of all, thank you very much to you and Samsung. Thank you for everybody in the audience for taking time. Because at the end of the day, really that's what writing this book is all about, reaching people and having impact. Now, how did we want to have impact with this book? What Stefan is saying, and what all of you know already, is that there is a whole slew of AI books out there now. And I'm not even talking about the very technical AI books. I'm talking about AI books that come at the topic from a business strategy angle, sometimes from a policy angle. We felt there was a gap in the literature. There was a whole issue area, if not two issue areas, that were not very well discussed. The first one was that we felt most of the books out there were either taking a very utopian or dystopian perspective of the topic, right? Why? Because it's entertaining. It's entertaining to talk about the dangers of AI taking over our lives and machines running us, Skynet, Terminator, and the like, right? Equally, we've seen some more utopian movies coming out of Hollywood, and that's attractive because usually the AI is played by an attractive Hollywood actor. You know, we're not disputing that some of these utopian, dystopian futures are a possibility, but we felt by focusing this far out, and we're talking, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years out, talking about a general intelligence that frankly we're very far from achieving at the moment. By doing that, we were missing tremendous opportunity both for economic and for human growth, right? So we felt that we needed to write a book about where AI is today and then extrapolate out maybe 15, 20 years. So essentially going out by one generation. Still very relevant for everybody in the room who has a career. And for those of you like me who have children, you know, we're starting to think about the world that we are creating and leaving for our kids. So that was number one. The second one was that we felt these books were all written by people who came out of either the Western or Chinese research and development establishment, right? The Bostroms of this world, the Kai-Fu Lees of this world, these are AI experts, world-renowned, and certainly they need to have a voice and they have a lot to teach us. But there is a lot more happening in the world of artificial intelligence than just Silicon Valley and Shenzhen or Beijing. And so we felt that there was also room for a book that was going to describe what was happening globally in artificial intelligence. What are the different types of entrepreneurship? What are the different types of solutions? What are the different types of policies that are being implemented out there to give us more of a well-rounded global perspective of artificial intelligence, right? And we can talk a little bit later about where we see this world going and why it is multipolar and not bipolar, and what the interesting aspects are of that. But those were the two reasons. So when Mark Nitzberg, my co-author, who is sending his very best regards, unfortunately he couldn't be here today, when we got together literally 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, we said we have to write a book that touches on those two missing points. And at the end of the day, both of us are, I won't say techno-optimist because there's a negative connotation to that, but I will say that we are net optimistic that if we get in front of this thing, that we shape it, that we govern it in a smart way, and that sounds like an easy thing to say, it's a very hard thing to do without squishing opportunity, that we are in fact looking at the next growth horizon for not just businesses and economies, but for people, right? So we got together, wrote the concept for the book, found an agent, found a publisher, and here we are 2 years later.
Thank you. So when I read the book, I was actually surprised to find in a non-fiction book a sci-fi novel inside, kind of a book in the book, so to speak. And I really got I started to like Ava and Willow, who are the two main actors, and was almost thinking you could do like your own book out of that. But can you tell us a little more about why you have this sci-fi story within your non-fiction book?
I'd be very happy to. Yeah, it's something that people always mention to us as a differentiating thing when they read the book. They're saying, "Look, there's a lot of cool stuff in it," but what really struck me was the fiction story within the non-fiction book. I was recently at a meeting with executives, about 30 of them, at the German president's office in Berlin, and those aren't AI experts. They're not even technology experts. They may have regulated technology, but they are not experts like you are. And they said the one thing that makes this accessible, this topic, which is so deeply technical, is this fiction story. So the idea was to give it a fiction chapter in the book that would bring all the concepts that we had just explained and all the problems and all the examples to life in a way that is accessible to normal people, right? And those are not necessarily Silicon Valley types like you or me. I'm a tech person just like you are. But frankly, 95+% of the world is not as knowledgeable about technology and wanted to know, how does it change my life today and 15 years out? So this fiction story is a 2033, a story in the year 2033 that picks up on a factual element earlier in the book. As we discussed over lunch, right, there is a story in the book that actually relates artificial intelligence to my own personal background, to a cancer story in my family, and how we made decisions about how to beat the illness, the disease. And so we explain that story up front. Then we take you on a journey about what AI is doing today, where it's going, what people in the world are doing. On the back end, then we're picking up on the fiction story, and we're saying, you remember that story of Anne and the cancer decision? Well, now Anne's daughter is, what was the math? 28, I believe, right? Now Anne's daughter, my daughter, is 28 in 2033. What if she gets told by her doctors who are assisted by a medical AI, you are 75% likely to come down with cancer over the next 10 years. And it's a beautiful thing, right? Because all of a sudden, you can get ahead of the cancer thing, and she wouldn't have to suffer through the same pain that my wife went through. Yet, as you can imagine, when you get that kind of analysis or diagnosis and you have a choice to beat it before it happens, that will put a number of decisions in front of you that are very tough to make. How to change your life, maybe change your life dramatically. What kind of life do you want to live? We don't really have to make those decisions today, and there are some ethical implications to that as well, right? And they're not trivial. And insurance companies and the medical establishment are starting to talk about those, right? So from that, then we said, okay, what is my daughter's life in 2033? Her name is Ava in the book. What is Ava's life going to look like? Not even just concerning the cancer diagnosis, but everything: her relationships, her job, how she gets implicated in, or involved in, I should say, in a cybersecurity scheme. So it picks up on the various elements of things that we are experiencing today, such as alleged Russian hacking of Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts and things like that. So that's the chapter that brings all that to life.
So there's another actor in the book, in this fiction story, which is Ava's ex-boyfriend. His name is Connor, and I don't think this is a Terminator link you put in there, but Connor actually decides in the book basically to leave the US and to go to Canada and live in an AI-free zone, so where basically there's no AI around, and Do you think these AI-free zones will actually develop, and we will have something like that in the not too distant future?
So it's a really big question, and I should say all these names in the book, they were actually picked by my daughters, because they wanted their actual names used, and I said, I got to protect your privacy, and I suppose I just blew that right here, but they got to pick all those names. So all of those are names they picked. The issue that there are people who don't want to engage is real. There are people who are now, don't mean to assume anything, Stefan, but that are sort of our age or older, who are starting to say, and frankly, even some of the young ones that I'm teaching. So I'm teaching at a business school, and I'm teaching young students, not very young, but about 25 to 40 years old. And even some of them are starting to say, this whole privacy thing is really starting to bother me. And there are also people that I talk to that don't want to get into the race anymore, the digital race in society. And so the question is, what do we do with people who say, this is all very nice, and I don't want anybody else not doing this, but I, for one, would rather not participate. And that's a problem. Of course, you might say that's fairly naive, right? Because does that opportunity even exist still? I mean, we've been so busy closing the digital divide, giving everybody the means to be digital, that we never thought about the fact that there may be some people who don't want to be digital, at least not digital in the way of AI, right? Because AI gets in your head. And that's where many people draw the line. And they're saying, this is where it's different from the internet or from mobile or previous digital revolutions that we have all been part of, because now this thing is getting into my head, and that's where I stop, right? And so what do we do with these people? And we're seeing the negative consequences of this already. So, for instance, if you are, if you read Kai-Fu Lee's book, I just debated in a duel of books with him, last week, a wonderful conversation. We agree on many fronts, and one of the things that he said was we will have digital colonialism, because there are many parts of developing countries that are not digital, and they will never be digital as fast enough and as much as we need them to be. Now, why is he saying that? Not because he wants to necessarily make money off of them, but because if you don't have a digital footprint, you literally don't exist. Advertisers aren't interested in you. Other people cannot make sense of you. You are essentially dark. And being dark in the digital era is a really difficult thing, because you don't have a voice, right? You don't have any weight. You become undesirable. And that's not a good thing to be in society. So how do we protect people like that? How do we still involve them to still be part of the process, right? So this going dark is a real issue that we have to grapple with. In the book, there are examples here where we're showing in developing countries how AI entrepreneurs are using the technology to give people a voice, right? So there is one example there. It's called Touchable, of an entrepreneur in Nigeria who is using image recognition technology to enable illiterate parts of the population in Africa to take images of, let's say, an item they see in the street somewhere, maybe a woman with a beautiful headscarf, but they cannot, they don't know how to write, they don't know how to read. They might just take a picture, and then the picture will analyze and talk back to them. The technology will analyze the picture and talk back to them what the scarf is, what the materials are, where to get it, and how much it costs, thereby empowering illiterate people. So we are always in this mindset of empowering through digital, and now there's this whole other wave of people saying, you don't need to empower me. I don't want to be empowered this way, right? So we have never really dealt with that issue. That's not our frame of mind. So yeah, those will happen. Are they going to be the majority of the population? No, of course not. But they could be sizable, right? And if, here in the United States, we tend to care, imperfectly, I will submit to you, but we tend to care about minority populations. But you go to a place like China and, you will be told, well, a minority is small numbers by definition, no? And we say yes, and they say, then where is the problem? Right? And right, because for the sake of stability in society, and the society is 1.3 billion people, right? Yeah.
So you're defining us being in the cognitive era.
Yeah.
And one of the operating principles there is the symbio-intelligence. Can you explain that a bit?
So what we're saying in the book is that we all have to get used to machines, smart machines, making increasingly important decisions for us. And it's one thing if your Siri or whatever your favorite AI assistant is telling you, it's going to take you an hour and 15 minutes to get home. We recommend you take this other route so that it's only an hour, right? But it's yet a whole nother kettle of fish when it's saying, I will tell you which one of the treatment paths for your cancer you should take to have maximum probability that it will work, and you have to change your life or else you're not going to be covered by your insurance anymore, right? That's that's obviously from a business angle. I'm a businessman, right? I understand the power of statistics, and you have to do your business plans. And as a for-profit executive, I would say I sort of understand the rationale, right? But we as human beings also have a right to make our own decisions. So we have to work through the negotiation spaces between humans and machines. And as humans, we have to understand that there is tremendous power, good power in AI and making machines getting smarter and becoming advisors to us. But as in every relationship, as we get used to that, we also have to set some boundaries. We have to establish some rules. It's no different from a customer relationship. You sign a contract, right? An employment relationship, you sign a contract. You get married, you sign a contract. You have vows, and that's a contract. And some people are a bit more loose about it than others, but whatever your interpretation of a relationship with another human being is, you do understand there's a basic framework of rules, and that is up for negotiation. And so you have to continuously negotiate that. So we have to negotiate with the makers and the designers of these machines how we want that relationship, what we want that to look like, what are the freedoms that both sides have. And that's, I will grant you, a very individual thing. I might be much more comfortable with machines making many more decisions than, I don't know, my wife or my parents are. But how do we then scale these things? And so those are some tough decisions that we have to figure out in the era of, or in the cognitive era as we go into symbio-intelligence, right?
So let's switch gears a bit. There are a lot of news reports around an AI race around the globe. And there's US, there's China, there's Europe, there's Russia, and all of these things. First question, is it really a race? Yeah. Or is it something else?
So as you can tell from the slide behind me, there's lots and lots of press about this now. And there's different reasons for it, right? The first one is everybody loves the term race. Why? Because it's fun to watch a race. Somebody wins, another person loses. There's human drama in it. Who doesn't like a good competition? At least as long as we're just bystanding and watching it. So that's number one. And number two, of course, we now have leadership in a number of countries around the world, most notably our own, that sees the world in fairly zero-sum terms and in fairly confrontational terms. Whatever your political leanings are, I think it's fairly objective to say that that various leaders in China, in the United States, in places like Turkey, and elsewhere, frankly, are now saying we've got to take the gloves off and we have to get into competition mode with other countries. So there is this air of a Cold War 2.0 that has been proclaimed, that some authors and pundits are using out there. And so some of these are very easy, right, to understand. They strike you through their simplicity. They're very appealing to many parts of the population, right? And so we are dealing with that nomenclature. It's unfortunate because you had just asked me for my personal opinion, neither I nor people like Kai-Fu Lee, but I'll let him speak for himself, I don't believe in this being a race, at least not a race against another country. I do believe that some countries need to buckle up and get ready for the cognitive era. You're in my home country, Germany is one of them, a very advanced country that is coming at AI from behind and is now struggling to catch up. So it's a race against oneself and against getting better at this whole digital thing. But it's not necessarily China racing against, Japan, or the United States racing against China. Because there aren't any obvious winners and losers. China is good at some things, and it'll carry those things into other countries, and we can talk about this through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is about 65 countries or 46% of global GDP. That creates a Chinese model for much of the world. Now, we have, and always have had, a very Anglo-American Western model of driving globalization and technology-led globalization. That's another model. But as countries look at these two models and they're developing their own capabilities, they're starting to say, you know what, I like this about the Chinese model, and this about the American model. The rest I don't like so much. I'll craft my own. We are not really in a bipolar world. We're very much in a multipolar world. Our research has shown that there are other countries that are fairly advanced, like South Korea, right? The home of Samsung. And there's a lot of commercial weight behind large Korean chaebols like Samsung. So there is an alternative model there. Are we going to like everything about that model? No. And some people are saying that what works in South Korea doesn't automatically work elsewhere, and you all know that story. You live that story, I suppose, every day. The same is true with the Japanese, right? In Japan has a very tolerant view of artificial intelligence and of robots. And the reason is cultural, right? For one, Japan's culture is colored by Shintoism, which is a philosophy that says, look, it's all the same. Whether you are human or an animal or a rock, it's all on one level. We are different things, we do different things, we have different competencies, but at least in theory, right, maybe not in practice, but in theory, we need to treat each other and everything with the same amount of respect, right? Now, humans are complicated and that doesn't happen, but at least that's the baseline. In Western countries, especially North America and Europe, we have a much more hierarchical view of what life and worthiness to live and be respected means, right? There is God, then there is human, then there's animal, and then there's everything else. And when we're very honest with each other, it's really God, man, woman, animal, everything else, right? I mean, we're struggling with that right now with the whole Me Too movement. And so we have a very hierarchical point of view, and it's much easier to feel threatened by artificial life like AI or like robotics, whereas the Japanese are saying, look, we don't have a problem with this. This robot looks like a human, that's a great thing. It talks like a human, that's a great thing. By the way, the Japanese are facing huge demographic issues, as you probably know. They're lacking young people, they're not making enough babies. And frankly, they're also not very fond of immigration. So if you're not making babies and you're not letting people in the country, what's left but robots, right? And so they're very pro-robot. In fact, stores in Japan are now starting to reduce their hours because they can't find enough people to serve behind the counters. So it's having a real economic impact. So does that model work for us in America? Does it work for us in Europe? So far, the answer is no, it doesn't. But there are elements of it that we can learn. So there are many different ways, and then there's, of course, Europe with a GDPR and a very strong sense of protection. There are different models around the world, and they all cross-fertilize. So this is not the first Cold War, right, which was a much simpler, much more ordered world.
So let's maybe go back to the US-China topic you started with. And the one big question seems to be, will the US lose its advantage over China, potentially the rest of the world? That's something, what's your thinking there?
Yeah, so there are some pundits that say America has already lost this race. Okay, and I mean, I don't want to pretend it's a race. I don't think it's a race. But even if you were to think the non-existing race, even if you were to think we're in direct competition, right? And I don't want to be naive. There are some national security concerns that are very well founded, right, in the United States, and I want to acknowledge that. But even if we were in a direct head-to-head competition, the United States is still doing pretty well. When you're looking at the statistics behind me, you'll see that on some fronts, China seems to be leading, such as the number of AI publications, right? But when you look closely, then you'll see some indicators behind me that say, yes, in the raw number of publications it does, but not in the amount these publications get cited. And that is what matters globally. So having a paper filed somewhere is less important than how much that paper is getting used in terms of how influential the paper is. The same is true for patents. So it's been well publicized that China is publishing patents like crazy, and the government is very much in favor of that. But a very tiny amount of those patents are actually globally defensible compared to the United States, right? 1.3% or whatever it says behind me versus 74%. So most of the AI patents that are globally defensible are still American patents. And there is a whole slew of things like, number of faculty, number of AI startups behind me, where you see that we are still, if you wanted to frame it like that, ahead, okay? All I'm doing here is to say, wait a minute, let's not go so fast. On the other hand, of course, we have to acknowledge that China is coming up very fast. Its model has been very successful. They have lifted 400, 500 million people out of poverty over the last 40 years. What a major accomplishment. It is unrivaled in global history. Now, you and I also know it came at the expense of 30 million people dead during the Cultural Revolution. It comes at the expense of dissidents being imprisoned. It comes at the expense of 1 million Uyghurs who happen to be Muslims in the northwestern provinces, being literally interned. Okay, but that's a very Western perspective. From a Chinese perspective, and frankly from the perspective of many countries in Eurasia, the Chinese model is unbelievably successful, and they want a piece of it. They would like to replicate that. At the same time, they're looking at the United States and they're seeing your democracy is kind of dysfunctional. Your internet companies, witness Facebook, are not trustworthy, and they're saying, at least in China, if one of our internet giants were to sell data like Facebook did with Cambridge Analytica, the government would put an immediate stop to it. What's the U.S. government doing? And the answer is nothing, at least not so far, right?
So maybe that's a good lead-in. So let's assume, so you're advising a lot of groups and countries, and you mentioned that you did some advice to the German side on the German AI strategy. So let's assume you would advise the US government on AI strategy. What would be your advice? What should we do? Yeah,
that's a great question. I'm not sure that they will take my advice, but if I were to give it anyway, no, look, I mean, we've had conversations at OSTP, both OSTP under Obama and OSTP now, and there are some very bright people working there who have very good intentions. And if I were to advise them, I would say a few different things. The first one is, don't define AI too narrowly. And that's a very common thing to do. Many countries around the world to say, let's do AI as machine learning, right, which is the current wave of AI. And let's be very application specific on where in industry will AI help me. And that's where we'll put our money, right? That's understandable for small countries who want to get their industries ahead. For large countries like the United States who lead in breakthroughs, I would say that's short-sighted. We need to fund adjacent technologies around machine learning as well. So the next frontier of AI is going to be heuristics, right? So we have to put money into, the right column over here, heuristics models, and we are, in the United States, we are looking at that. We need to make sure that within computer science, we take a look at this. That could be the next wave of AI. But I think, honestly, if you ask me, as somebody who studies innovation a lot of the future breakthroughs will happen between this and other science and technology areas, like quantum computing, like cognitive neuroscience and brain science, things like brain-computer interfaces, new statistical methods, bioinformatics, and then, of course, genomics, right, genetic engineering. Because we learn things there with computer science, and those areas cross-fertilize. So I would tell America, let's invest broadly in some of these adjacent areas as well to make sure these sparks are really flying. Because that is also where, compared to China, the United States still has an advantage. We have an unbelievably broad and very deep depository of breakthrough science in many different fields. That diversity is part of the strength of America, right? So that's definitely one I would say we can do very well already and should keep boosting. Now, the other parts are we need to teach our children early on in middle school, frankly, here in America, if not even earlier in kindergarten. We need to teach them data science. And I'm not saying coding, and you all know the difference, but to many people out there who are not technical, that sounds like the same thing, and it's obviously not. But being able to interpret what the smart machine does, what the data is that we are sourcing. Is it biased? Is it bad data? Is it corrupted data? Is it good data? Is it all the data we need? Is it broad enough, right, to avoid the wrong decisions? So judgment capability in data science is really, really important, and we got to start teaching these young people early on. China is starting to do this with basic coding. They're not where we think they need to be for obvious political reasons, but we think that kind of critical interpretive capability is really key. Let's teach our children that not everything the AI spits out is good information. The second one is we need to put emphasis in education on what we as humans do really well already. And we are really not doing as much as we could. We all think we're good because we're human beings. We must be good at being human. But as I say that, of course, all of you will go, well, no, we're really not, right? How many times have you been on the phone with a call center representative and it was an utterly frustrating experience? Why is that? Because they act like a machine, right? They tell you things and then you question it and they're like, well, sir, that's what it says here, right? Well, a computer can do that job much better. I may as well talk to a machine. And so we have to teach people to get better at emotional intelligence, at empathy, and at other things that we do really well. We do really well transposing knowledge from one area into another area. A machine cannot do that very well just yet. It may happen at some point, but we're not there yet, right? And then things like leading, coaching, mentoring, all of these seem very soft, but they're actually the stuff that's very defensible vis-a-vis the machine. So we have to get better at teaching that, and at my business school, we have started to pair those two facets, right? So those are just some ideas. Frankly, in this world where we seem to be so isolationist in the United States, to me that's the wrong instinct. We should become the hub, the global network hub for AI innovation. And instead, Canada is trying to play that role. Europe is trying to play that role because they don't have a choice. They don't have big tech companies like the big internet companies in the US and China. So they're saying the only way we can do this is to pool our data, pool our resources, create networks, and be a global contributor, right? So I think that should be like the third pillar to figure out how we can lead in international collaboration.
Well, that's a great lead-in into governance, and you talk quite a bit in your book about governance, and you also, when you were here the last time, you spoke about the Magna Carta for AI, and one thing which I thought is interesting, that there's already a lot of organizations worldwide to kind of do things around governance. Do you think there are enough organizations there, or do you think we need more and they need a different direction in terms of how they approach governance?
Yeah, so there are established international governmental organizations like the United Nations, of course, that are looking at some of these AI technologies when it comes to autonomous weapons. And I can definitely see how, because these are, for the most part, state actors with defense budgets, that you want to have heads of state and ministers and secretaries at the table. But for all of the other AI topics, frankly, the United Nations and other IGOs don't really have enough technical expertise. The ITU is a bit of an exception there, but frankly, our track record of negotiating internet accords through the ITU hasn't been great. So that's that bucket. Then there is a whole new slew of organizations, like the Partnership on AI, like the World Economic Forum Center on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I have a little bit of an involvement there, and others that are private sector initiatives that are trying to lead this in an inclusive way. But, for some of these, you're hearing rumblings that it's still pretty clear that these are driven by corporate profit interests. And clearly that's a bias. Look, again, I'm a business professor, I want to turn a profit, but we're now experiencing customers and citizens saying, no, not like this, my friend, right? And so we have to take account of that and be honestly inclusive, truly honestly inclusive. And it's messy and it's wicked, and we have to figure out how to do that, right? Scientists are coming up and are saying, okay, we as scientists feel responsible. And there's the Asilomar principles around the Future of Life Institute, etc. Musk is part of that as well. That's wonderful. We have to have that. But that still doesn't include the everyday person. So we have proposed a different mechanism, and we know it's going to morph 15 times. But we have said there needs to be something like a multi-stakeholder Congress by region, and that bubbles up solutions to the global level, because we need a voice for the everyday person. Not everybody will want to be part of this, but AI can help us now take all these disparate data streams from the mobile phone and flow them into larger governance schemes, right? So if there's anything we use AI for, we should use it for good, beneficial processes like that. That Congress needs to make recommendations on a digital Magna Carta, and they then need to flow that up to the government level. Now, interestingly, we're not the only ones proposing this. In chapter 7, I believe, the closing of the book, we're describing how that could work, if you're interested. Other people are starting to use the same term. It's not rocket science. Everybody knows the Magna Carta, right? But Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web, has used the same term and says we need something like that. Anthony Giddens, who was in the House of Lords in the UK, has used the same term, and in fact I'm meeting with him in January to figure this out. And then there's 2 or 3 foundations in Europe that are looking at this as well. So there is now a bit of this awareness that we need to have some code of conduct, some charter of rights that needs to be based on citizens, not just on corporations and scientists, right? Yeah.
Cool. So let's hope in a year from now when you come back that we will get some progress on that. And
hopefully, yeah, hopefully. Meanwhile, you'll probably see some other things happening that may be relevant to you in your everyday life. That is the question of how do you as engineers, software designers, how do you make sure that you understand what consequences your code has on societal systems, right? That's not trivial. We can't blame you for every piece of software that goes and does something that could be potentially harmful, and yet we also can't close our eyes and say, oh, that's not my problem, right? So on a more bottom level, how do you ensure that this code doesn't cause mayhem in systems, as we're seeing with Facebook and others?
That's definitely a good question. Maybe with that, let's open up the question here for the audience. And so if you have any questions, actually we have a book a question kind of. So if you ask questions, you probably will get one of Olaf's books going forward. So there's one over there.
I'm happy to sign them too.
Hello, my name's Kenneth Malik. So my question kind of has to do with the epistemology of AI and the limits of understanding of computing. So I'm wondering if you're familiar with the works of Hubert Dreyfus, particularly his paper on Heideggerian AI and how AI needs to become more Heideggerian. I'm interested in if you think that AI can ever potentially understand being itself, and if the limitation of AI not being able to understand being might mean that there's a limit fundamentally to how it can be applied. Thank you.
That's a good question, Kenneth, right? Yeah, it's a good question, Kenneth. When we did interviews for the book, it turned out that things like consciousness and meta-level self-awareness are going to be really difficult for machines to acquire. And part of that is because we don't actually know what that is in human beings, right? So consciousness is an emergent property. You can't deduce it into its parts, and you cannot easily construct it either, right? There are different parts all interacting in our brains, and we understand just how many synapses and neurons there are, and we understand that electrical signals go back and forth. But out of that messiness that we haven't fully mapped yet, bubbles up some level of, I am who I am, and I'm trying to understand myself in the context. So if we don't necessarily know how that happens in us, how could we possibly say that will or never will happen in machines? It could be an emergent property in a machine that we design, right? So we don't really know how to answer that question just yet, but we do know that we cannot exclude the possibility, because by their very nature, emergent systems are very hard to predict. So until that happens, can the machine truly understand who I am if it can't understand itself? That's a good question. There are scholars working on how machines can understand human beings better. My co-author's center at the University of California, Berkeley, the Center for Human Compatible AI, is working on this. We have scholars there teaching machines how to observe a human being and make sense of the often nonlinear behavior, right? And how to interact with human beings just like a human being would. We also have scholars at USC and elsewhere who are trying to understand the emotionality of a human being. Where do these emotions come from? Are they predictable? How do I deal with them? If I'm a computer and I'm dealing with an emotional response, how do I deal with that in an appropriate way so the human being says, well done, right? And I trust you, which is not trivial. So people are working on it. I think it's going to take a while for that emergent property to evolve, but I would not exclude that possibility, right? A basic level of meta-level of awareness is not that hard to achieve. A machine can understand, okay, where am I? What does the room look like? How many people are here? And how are they talking to me? And is there chaos, or is it pretty streamlined? And how should I therefore deal with it? Those are pretty rational processes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have some sense of being or purpose or some assessment of your being or purpose. Does that make sense?
Right, yes. I think that I guess I'm more interested in kind of the limits to this, because I think that really AI up until now has been about how to create these rules and how to model this chaos, and kind of the central point of Dreyfus was that throwing more computation into this won't really change the fundamental notion of there being something, and I might disagree with the notion of a kind of physicalist interpretation of the mind, but I'm interested in kind of how that may differ on your side.
Yeah, no, when you say you differ with the sort of the physical interpretation of the brain, I'm assuming you're going into the spiritual realm, that there may be some things that we just can't explain. That doesn't mean they don't exist.
Not necessarily a spiritual one, but merely that being itself is observing itself, and so that emergent property is a property of being, and conscious beings themselves are being itself, if that makes sense.
I'm trying to track that, yes. So the question is, at what point does the machine constitute a being, right?
Or understand it's a being itself.
Correct. And I guess my answer to that earlier was, we don't actually know at what point, because you're right to point to the limitations of the current system. Neural networks aren't going to get us there. Is heuristics going to get us there? Maybe, but we just have not, I guess the machines that we have designed are not complex enough yet to get us to the complexity of the human brain. And so we're looking at, probably at least another decade or so until some combination of heuristics and quantum computing can help us simulate something as complex as a brain, and then draw some conclusions and answer that question. But so far, nobody really has provided a satisfactory answer to that.
Hi, my name is Sarah. Thanks for the talk. The question is about legal responses to AI, and in the countries that you studied, have you seen any legal systems sort of responding or attempting to respond to new situations thrown out by AI?
So we've seen some of the regulations or tentative regulations around autonomous driving, obviously in the United States. We have seen PR stints like Saudi Arabia recognizing citizenship, giving citizenship to a humanoid Japanese robot. Sophia, that was fun. But I don't think anybody has actually quarreled with who is responsible. When your AI advises you to do something, you do it. What if Alexa says, here, take this medication because I'm sensing you're sick, and it makes you worse and you die? Is Amazon responsible? Right, and I'm sure Amazon lawyers would have plenty to say about that. I'm not sure that we have reached a societal consensus around that. So no, part of the issue is that I think we're still in the mode of experimenting here as well as in China, and that on both sides we are leery of over-regulating the experimentation, the sandbox, right? And I can completely appreciate that. I think there is a chance that Europe will be first, because Europe likes to develop frameworks based on what could be. Right? But currently, no, we haven't.
I never have questions, always comments. I don't really understand how we can talk about a machine when it's actually the machine. I mean, humans can't communicate with hundreds of terabytes a second, and the machine does. So is there any sense that these lines on the map are actually a fiction in our minds, and to a machine, they don't exist? The internet is working, right? What people in China believe their phone says affects everything we do here, too. They might overconsume and global warming. So our elections, I can't imagine that we have the luxury of deciding what our government should do about it. I don't think they have anything, there is no control knob. You can say, I want my privacy, but nobody has it, right? It's not a legislative question. It's long gone, right? So I think we really have to turn it off. And I think that we're sort of skirting that. There is no a machine, right? There is the machine.
So when it comes to privacy and sort of protection of personhood, as it were, many people are saying, look, that's sort of, and I've heard this mantra in many places before, and particularly here in Silicon Valley, where innovators just as recent as 3-4 years ago said, look, privacy is a thing of the past. It doesn't exist anymore. And I think what we're hearing is, oh yes, it does, because we want it to exist. And this is not just people our age. This is literally young people saying, we now understand what you told us about how important privacy is, and for the first time, we're now seeing that we're being manipulated by corporate or political interests, and we don't want that. So does that mean we have to turn it off? I don't think we do. I think it's a question of business model design. And I think we need to challenge ourselves, and look, I'm a business professor, so the challenge is incumbent upon me as well, to figure out how can we give people ownership or at least a larger say over when they release what kind of data. And that can be done. Is that messy? Sure. But I don't think we can sacrifice human privacy and dignity for the sake of simple solutions. So people are saying we want more control. And I think if you give them more control, they will eventually give up more privacy, right? As long as they have visibility in, how is my data being used? What do I give it up for? Is that particularly valuable to me? I might be willing to do that as long as you tell me you're going to keep my data safe. And I think that's, that is, there are companies out there that say, I will not sell your data to people like Cambridge Analytica, right? Does that mean it's a perfect leak-proof system? No, but I think we can do a lot better than Facebook has done, right? So it's a business model design question to me. I think the technical solutions will flow from that, but I don't think privacy is over.